song playing, and because we want to give everyone the chance to join.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the song finishes, the welcome slide will be removed, and we'll request you to start with the land acknowledgement and then invite Dean Jones to deliver welcome remarks.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll be back in 1 minute.
So Neil, you will spotlight the video of whoever's speaking, right? Just you will handle that kindly.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that after the introductions, everybody will be turning their video camera off except for Dr. Walcott and Dr. Brand. Is that correct?
After Dean, yeah. So we whatever you prefer, Neil. Whatever's easiest from your end. As long as whoever's speaking gets the spotlight, that's all that matters.
I mean,
Yeah,
we can all turn off, and Dionne can speak, and then when she's finished, then I can come on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's what we should do.
That sounds great. Okay, everyone. So I will give you a 5-second countdown to broadcast time because we are here. It's 5 o'clock. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca, most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land.
Miigwech, and welcome to the 2020 R.W.B. Jackson Lecture. My name is Glenn Jones, and it's my great honor to be Dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. This annual lecture is named for Dr. Robert Jackson, the founding director of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Dr. Jackson's vision was for an institute that would challenge existing orthodoxies, an institute that would not only play a foundational role for educational research in Ontario, but would also play a role in transforming the educational system. An institute that would not be afraid to experiment and challenge. The idea for today's Jackson Lecture came from the OISE Black Faculty Caucus. Part of the notion is to build on the important legacy of scholarship at OISE that has contributed and is contributing so much to our understanding of anti-racism education, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, and Black studies in education. The second, and perhaps most important objective, is to continue to acknowledge and address systemic anti-Black racism in our institute, in our university, in our educational system, and in our society. Our need to learn, to reflect, and to act. The fact that more than 1,500 people have registered for this event says something about our desire to learn from Dr. Dionne Brand. Dr. Brand has had a long relationship with our community. We are extremely proud that she is an alumni of OISE, and she honored us by returning to accept an honorary doctorate from the University of Toronto a few years ago. She is an internationally acclaimed poet, novelist, documentarian, and activist. And the challenging brilliance of her words, of her contributions, of her impact have been recognized through the Order of Canada, the Governor General's Award for Poetry, the Trillium Prize for Literature, and I could go on and on. She published 2 new volumes in 2018, The Blue Clerk, a volume of poetry, and the Toronto Book Award-winning novel, Theory. In the spirit of introduction, both to our guest speaker and to the context in which we are situated, I'd like to read a short passage from her work, not from one of her acclaimed poems or novels, but from a piece she published in the Toronto Star in July, and I quote, "All my life, I have lived with the chronic fever of anti-Black racism. So many of us have, and for so many years, generations. I know this as I go through my daily acrimonious back and forth with the commentators, experts, and politicians as they attempt to manage the pandemic as narrative, as calculus, but not yet as reckoning. I know, as many do, but I've been living a pandemic all my life. It is structural rather than viral. It is the global state of emergency of anti-Blackness. What the COVID-19 pandemic has done is expose even further the endoskeleton of the world. I have felt tremendous irritation at the innocence of those people, mostly, but not only white, finally up against their historic and present culpability in a set of dreadful politics and dreadful economics, ecocidal and genocidal." Following her lecture, Dr. Brand will engage in conversation with Professor Rinaldo Walcott, an internationally recognized and acclaimed University of Toronto scholar and activist. He is known to many for his contributions to cultural studies, queer theory, and Black studies, but also for the time and emotional energy he devotes to public discussions and cultural dialogue focusing on anti-Black racism. It is now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Brand to deliver the 2020 Jackson Lecture.
Thank you very much, Dean Jones, for inviting me to do the R.W.B. Jackson Lecture this year, this strange and ominous year. And also thank you to Sim Kapoor for all the organizing around the event. Thank you also, Dr. Walcott, for being not only my interlocutor this evening, but my friend. I want to offer an essay, poem, really, and it's called Nomenclature for the Time Being. Just a few small things about the essay poem. The I in the poem is the I of a Black aesthetic. A Black aesthetic, I say, not the Black aesthetic, since I want to leave this room open as it is, not open to question, as in, is it a Black aesthetic, but open to multiplicity, to variation, to movement, to opacity, and to calibration. The I and the we in the poem is an aesthetic consciousness who has moved about in the world, experiencing, looking, acting in, thinking on, drawing on what it has lived and studied and absorbed, what they have lived, have been immersed in, apprehended, certain phenomena observed, synthesized, and brought these phenomena into arrangements of feeling, arrangements of the senses. So this speaker of the poem is that aesthetic that hovers, that draws from the world, and is an active seeker in the world. At root, this aesthetic consciousness is in search of what Robert Hayden called the beautiful, needful thing in his poem, Frederick Douglass, and is drawn by that imperative into the world. The I or we of the poem is and are part of the register of accumulated observations, part of the archive of facts and truths, experiences collected over the time of Blackness. At her exhibition, Excavation, a Site of Memory, the artist, filmmaker, and poet Sylvia Hamilton placed a braid of hair and a red ribbon on a hogshead barrel. Across from the installation, she placed another register from Nova Scotia, 1772, September the 1st, which read partly, girl, named Thursday, about 4.5 feet, broad set, with a lump over her right eye, had on when she ran away a red cloth petticoat, a red baize bedgown, and a red ribbon about her head. Thursday ran off, a red coat, a red ribbon in her hair. It is the red coat and more, the red ribbon I am trying to follow, not to capture, but in order to read Thursday's plans for the already realized intricate arrangements of living in them. So too, Katrine, who flees Malgré Tout estate in South Trinidad on the 7th of September, 1824. She, the register says, is stout-made and pregnant and passes herself as free. When one makes those kinds of arrangements, one is trying to arrive at, one is heading to the beautiful, needful thing. These are the kinds of arrangements that the women and girls in Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, beautiful experiments were making, theorizing, living, and imagining in the 20s and 30s, moving to Philadelphia and New York, or that people like my mother and aunt, part of the Windrush generation, moving to London, were imagining, or that the women in Makeda Silvera's Silenced who moved to Canada from Jamaica in the 60s and 70s were theorizing and imagining. Black people always moving with intention into their own imagining of liberation. This poem, essay, is in the register of our quotidian, thinking its way through some of the materials of the now and making an assemblage of the now through that lens of the beautiful, needful thing, those present future arrangements of living. These plans, of course, require a hard look at the terrain, and so the poem travels that terrain. And I begin a nomenclature for the time being. There, the apocalyptic reports have come true. The sequel's gesture in our arterial solvent. We stopped recounting the atrocities in telephone calls. Then we stayed awake, lambent. There are illuminate rectangles under our tables. We meet for dinners, languid, nauseous. The intervals of talk sped to nothing. Transfused presently, we heard a minute of silence for a few decades. Chronic, venous, insufficient. Anyone can knock us over, my dear. And we became scientists of this, of out, under force, out of water, ablative. There was that time in a room on Calle Nueva when the world crushed my chest, like the world, like a boulder, as if the world were a boulder, as if gravity knitted sternum to finger, to hill, to lip, to thread, to floor, to chair, to boat, to gull, to Calle Nueva Alta, to thought, to hem, to a bus, to three-note pencils, to umbrella, to foot, to insect, to jaw, to stem, to M8 lagoon nebula, to deneb, to fish, to velocity, to sheet, to wing, to light socket, to metal rail, to postage, as if gravity melted oxygen tank, to grief, to hip, to shoreline, to chair, to drinking glass, to green light, to xiphoid, to November, to tailpipe, till I know everything. It was 5 p.m. all day that day. The sky, if I say the sky's small arithmetic, its inscription, its echo, through one undone instance and the other, we discovered new diseases traveling the floor of our tissue. We leathered these in catalogs of our antigens, what with one thing and another. I am only ever uttering every other word, as all articulations are shaped by ideology. Of this, understand, it has been several winters to the next. We lost absorption. We broke down into smaller molecules. We needed iodine, polyphenols, annatto seeds, the analytics of arriving, and the whole dictionary of the knowledges of seabirds not to succumb. The storekeepers set up as our guardians and our friends and our comrades. They smiled with us one day. They took whiskey with our enemies too. We read their books, took in their alphabets like popsicles and lesion ointment. It is a good thing that they don't know who we are. To begin with, we saw nothing. Nothing evaporated. There are dingy pictures of picturelessness. The year was endless. The occipital lobe driven, maximizing propylene yields, how the cyclical literatures made our veins theoretical, which is to say, I myself, I'm sick today, sick always, in the tetravalence in any specific region, or the orbits elemental and inorganic seeming, a stellar career I've made of waiting. Carbon, seeing. What they saw on the periphery, they now see in matter and resurrect and replicate the dayless days. The beautiful innocence of those who live at the center of empire, their wonderful smiles, their sweet delight, and their singular creation of the word hope when I am actually dying. But now we enjoy them, their sweetness, their love of us. We envy their cuisine, their insouciance. No, truly, I am not being facetious. I am honest in my lovely amazement. The scrim of their philosophies when they say humanity, everyone, we, these are not lies. We misapprehend the immuring function of their dogma. How can I assure anyone there is no rancor? Trust me on this. With a world's gaze focused on reducing emissions, apply now renewable hydrogen alliance. Let us return the invisible light, something coming through we could not get a hold of. We never learned to be quiet, though the algorithm overwhelmed us. We've taken down the bookshelf and we'll depend on any chronic hour and our razor-bladed veins, our cardboard signs. What is it to talk as if the world you know is the world? I cannot be bothered with that. I cannot be bothered. I'll go along as if we were already the life world. These informal economies, these small doorways selling everything. Years have passed. All my good life. That is right. Great day. Good morning. I notice the small globe, the dead theory of humanity in Spanish and Italian, the Anglo-American prison of thought in a bookshop on Calle Porvenir in Cartagena. I have seen the translations and the instructional manual of economics. The worst things they said about me, they said every time, and I don't mourn this. I read your newspapers. I am only measuring your temperature. I'm only making my diagnosis of your sentences and your ailment. I mean, by your syntax, you are not alive. And I am no longer in the trade of unraveling what is buried. I am no longer helping us see what is seen. This does not seek a remedy. This does not need a balm. This needs an ending. I am not suggesting anything called human. That is a discredited theory. Every corner under siege, this most gentle imagining is bitter with innocence and expertise. Of that world, I am not suggesting anything. They were allowed to walk around in newspapers and have children and announcements of children and their good life. They had the temerity to sell me newspapers and journals and megabytes of their lousy activities, and I bought them, and it punished me to hear their awful news of their victories over me, and made me laugh and love them as they insisted. And there was stupid me in my fluffy slippers and tattoo with a whale. There was a cloud or two in Montreal, and believe me, I love concrete, and believe me, I love rubber. But now that I am leaving, I will not miss their acidity. Homeless. There's a mauve cloud on its own along Boulevard Saint-Laurent. Relentless surveillance in the underpass until the yellow exit where a pretty baby appears in a carriage. The usual cops are in the usual place, on a telephone at Saint Antoine, with the wedding on the beach. What in this nothing morning should we say? All the bicycles, all the runners, all the furious production, the steaming concrete, the containers vers IT voie de droite, let us go east. The lined and last of the Inca in Cuzco putting out her hand. Why wear that dress, innocent and fatal? You cannot meet the world in any other way now. When could you meet the world in any other way? The deep silence of capital, the long field, the crickets, perhaps the only sovereign things. Even the birds have altered their flight and song. The deal is complete. The medicals will give oxygen and loneliness, the little bits of plastic adhesives in the lungs, the fecal plains, the drooling sky. Not true. The sky is the sky always, the sky wondrous, the sky under which the acid oceans. What is it to lament this? I am not really lamenting. I am hating this. I am loving this. I am turning into the something necessary to live this. Don't listen. I'm wearing the sign, do not look at me. That is my designation, do not look at me. My life used to be close to those sirens. I notice the crushed brain, the ones who keep people sleeping with their art, somnolent and private, Do not distort the violence with any water, any love, any laughter, nor ink. Do not. It was 5 p.m. all day today. The sky. There isn't the psychiatry yet to take me out of my madness. When I played tennis with such sadness, when I drank wine with such sadness, when I watched the sea with such sadness, when I drove to the lake with such sadness, and all the things that happened with such sadness, these were the best days. And my friends held me with such holding. And they ate with me holding. And they laughed with me holding. We were in San Jose holding, and my chest was empty holding. We were in Santiago at Plaza de Armas holding, and my arms with such sadness. We were in Phnom Penh at the Russian market holding. 55 stories in glass buildings with such sadness, and I still with my rough eyes such holding. Disappearances. What is the nature of monument or memory? Does it matter? Or is it too a sentimentality? I experience it as both sentimentality and the fact. How a whole set of events must sometimes be rescued from sentimentality. I do not have day. I do not have moonlight. I do not believe in time. I do believe in water. I cannot wait. I cannot believe their earth to say something small and then say nothing. Well, to move forward. These people, with their crude minds, think they can love anything, think they can see anything, think they can notice a brushstroke in a painting, think they can know the art of the world. All their lives are spent clawing the grace of things, mangling the sheen of things, collecting the raw instants. They lift their arms and displace millions. Why am I on earth with these people? I am in hell, sister. The man from Ghana on a street in Venice. Is this a protest? Is this a protest? I asked. There is only the word for holding. There is no holding. The neck of Jacaranda approaches a holding. The time I lived on Calle Donceles. We did everything not to kill you. Turned ourselves inside out. The General Hospital asked me to donate this ugly heart of mine. I said, no, no one should have it. Let us leave it at that. No one should have it. The monsters are talking all over the world. They are talking an insane language. They have adopted all the dance music, and in this language we are inanimate. They are phagic and happy. They are multidisciplinary and multilingual, and we are finding it hard to move our limbs again. The government sent me the results. My cervix was normal. The racial intrigues spinning off local narrations, the intrigues of stasis, the layers of inconceivability, intractable narrations, unforgivable narrations, my own measurements that may cause at any moment explosions that I suppress, but they detonate nevertheless in me. In me, the duration stones. I owe my beating heart a debt for its endurance, its persistence, its profound knowledge that is beyond any capacity to know, its amplitude, for taking these detonations and insisting on living, on beating, jumping to the roof of the ribs. I cannot know this amplitude, this latitude. I cannot know. I do not know its duration. I am destroying it. I am sure. I cannot conclude. This is the region outside the geometry of other considerations. I do not know its distractions, the scabs of its work. I interpret small signs of its breathless career, and I know its weight. I try another language, I invent rhetoric. I think perhaps this will be the intimate of the rate of killing. This will sustain, will wait out, but I know better. The simple region of my breathing, the encroachments melt, vein tissue. I know the rages I suppress, close regenerative neurons. I am wearing away the inside of my mouth. All this my heart must contend with, must ignore the absences in these hemispheres of lewd elevations. I remember now, and how many dreams I have with the same obligations as the waking life. These obligations have the same duty, the same amount of weight. as the ones admitted to reality. Therefore, they cause the same worries and anxieties. They register in the same regions. They are recorded in the documents of the veins, the durability of the knees. They employ time and they account. They appear on the schedule of the day. They take their quota of days and appointments. This is the region called surmounting. This is the volcano called evidence. Why do I keep anything sitting near a Technotitlan pyramid, forgetting one language after another, some last evening after another? This evening, the crate of worries and intentions has a sonus echo of musicians and sellers, the obscura of weather. I am talking to no one. I refuse to reproduce whiteness anymore. Do not speak to me. I cannot, not even quietly. I will not say good morning, no good evening, no good night, no oh, no why, no look out, no oh dear, no answer the question, what time is it? Or how are you? We tried everything. We even tried not living. Nothing worked. We even tried living our own lives. Nothing worked. We forgot us. Our sleep is ideological. Who sleeps well? I wonder. And capital sells time and takes time, exponential time, and fills time. It is rich with time and packed with time, chewing time calmly. All the cities busy with time. First they killed off all the people, namely us. Then they killed off all the earth. The birds are decorative. The other beasts, meta food. Here is meta death. We do not know if we will meet after the pandemic. So here we are. We always meet after the pandemic. Don't you remember? We never know what is going to happen. Now they don't know. That's one good thing. How do we manage fear, he asked. We don't. Fear is a necessary reaction, a good sign. My thanks to all who gave me fear. I know it now, all the time. Don't you remember 40 years ago? Is it 40? A life? Each year, the group of us offer jokes and bring more perfect unhappiness. Plastic and viral, bacterial, we are remainders of burning oxygen. We are just the end of helium. We are speeding, we are slow. Water doesn't end. I used to dance, you know. There are photographs. I lived in many apartments. The walls were some other material, intense material. I don't have to wonder who lives there now, several and broken in each case. Ours is theirs, their skeletal hold, oh love, is showing. Their arms are overburdened with us. We are sick today. They have admitted their stock futures turned positive. They will work through banks. We know where we live now, if we ever didn't. We must take a course now to smell and see our raw gangster fingertips. We're used to figures. We're used to numbers. But didn't you laugh with me in Montreal or Amsterdam or somewhere with Audra? That time when we were birds and we sent notes across 3 continents. What is that cellophane over my sky? What is that noise out my window? I can't sleep here. They don't account for their dreadful imagination. And this is how it went down. First, they persuaded us we needed technocrats. Then they persuaded us we needed businessmen. And then they persuaded us we needed fascists. And then we all had the flu, from which we never recovered. We were sick before. And this morning, closer to French and smoke gray, the sky up there, why, every turn here is to birds. We hate them so, they go on anyway. Indifferent on the road to the airport once, 2 egrets flew into the well of a truck, one de-winged, dead, the other landed, looking in astonishment. Any being can be astonished. Any bird lose any bird, bewildered by violence. This feels like Sunday in 1975, gloomy with rain and possibility. But this is local, not magnificent, when the big world is leaning on me, eating my shoulder. We left everything in the year 2020. We lost almost everything. We lost chance. Banality disappeared. The delightful disappeared in the city. My days are really short, but my weeks are long. Every day is lived, crisis. Wasn't it always so? The intimacy disappeared. The molecules of air decided all this. The epoch disappeared. And we, in all those coats, we looked like past lives of ourselves, as if we are looking at photos a century ago. And we were dressed in all the horrors, sanguine of our possibilities. And we with all our knives, with all our honeysuckle looks, not counting all the evenings. Me and have you to mind. I have my heart to take care of, if heart is what it is, if heavy is its leaf weight. And one afternoon in 2020, it felt enormous with its own metaphor, as if its chambers and pipework understood the frivolous assignment of living. I expect too much. I expect reality. The sun went down in our orbit, and what we made of these inconsiderable kilometers, breathing, the way we dissolved into doorways, salvage what we calculated, ribbons. What awaits us is disaster, not justice. I will look at this for a long time, over many days. How it is to turn over in your hand, over and over what it is. And when we were going with suitcases, the airport, the waiting room, the ledge to this world, when we spoke, it was of disasters. And when we arrayed all our intelligence against them, nothing happened. We came out each day, though, with flowers. We had to do this. We denied the scabs and the waterlogged lungs. We breathed water when there was no air. We grew gills and fins. Thank you. So that is a little bit of nomenclature for the time being. And I want to ask my friend Rinaldo to join me now.
Okay, I'm here.
There you are.
Yes.
I hope I haven't been too long.
You could have been longer. You should have been
Serious?
longer.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to be having a public conversation with you. And first, I should say thank you so much for cracking open the public lecture form, and my thing just disappeared. Seeing you, I can't see you anymore. See,
I'm here. Don't worry.
Immediately, there's a technical problem of some kind. Yes. So thank you for cracking open the public lecture as a form and a genre, and giving us indeed the beautiful, needful thing. A lot of those lyrics and words and phrases are going to live with us for a long time. I was wondering if we can talk about the kind of first set of stanzas in the poem essay. And as I listened to you, and one of the first things that cropped up to me as you opened up the poem was your long poem Ossuaries. But then I quickly realized this is not Ossuaries at all. There's something else going on here. There's something quite different going on in this poem essay. And at first, in the first stanzas too, there's this sense of a kind of bodily or skeletal set of descriptions. And but as one listens more carefully, they are more like curios, or like the vials and the beakers that one might encounter in the ethnological museum somewhere. These skeletons and what they hold in places like museums. The bare structure of the body is being revealed. Medicine and vaccines are hinted at, sickness and death. But yet there's a tremendous pulsating heartbeat in those first stanzas of the poem. And your words as you read them are almost propulsive. I wondered if you want to say something, Dan, or talk to us a little bit about how the time of COVID is shaping what's happening in this poem text.
Mhm. You're not incorrect in gesturing to ossuaries, of course, because this is the region, this is the area I've been thinking in and working in. And so while the figure in the work is not the figure or the figures in ossuaries, they are related. And they're related because, I often quote the anti-colonial revolutionary and poet from Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral, who said, culture is always in the life of a society, open or closed, uh, the more or less conscious result of the economic and political activities of that society, the more or less dynamic expression of the kinds of relationships which prevail in that society. So it's with that theoretical instrument that I set about selecting the words for the poems in general, and this one in particular, and that the words are a kind of descriptors of the time, of what we use, in the dynamic, or where we are situated in that dynamic that constructs the everydayness of the now. So the words speak to the kind of biodegradation and philosophical illness we walk around in at present, or that illness that permeates what they call the philosophy of democracy, if you will, right?
Mhm.
So in terms of turning to COVID, I think, and, Glenn Jones quotes from that piece that I wrote for the Toronto Star. And of course, I've continued to think about, like, what is it that we're living here now? And to try to be very specific about it, right? Black people have such a long history with this system that it's tempting to collapse, but it's important to identify the particular moment and the particular things going on. Like we've seen over the course of the last several months. Jump in anytime, Rinaldo.
I'm listening.
Talk to me a minute. Okay. We've seen over the course of the last several months, like various reactions, of the neoliberal state, to what has happened. First, surprise and panic, kind of, right? And because we were all surprised. And now there's a kind of retrenchment to pre-pandemic material life, right? In fact, that's always been on the horizon, right? We must return to pre-pandemic material life. And life at the level of philosophical ideas. So everywhere in the metropoles, anyway, in particular, you see the retrenchment of like payments to people for their living needs, and
Yes.
accompanied by the old philosophies, right? Businesses have to start up, and this is not so much in terms of this notion of jobs have to be. It's not so much concern for people who make a living by their labor, but of businesses who make a profit, right? And they are the entities that the government are mostly concerned with, as they were more volubly prior to the pandemic, right? And this logic kind of ignores people who never stop working, yeah, which is kind of most people. Those, essential and fungible workers in grocery stores, warehouses, fields, etc., factories, The idea that government is for people and accountable to people is the superficial philosophy. Large, I think, in a set of ideas circulated since what the Europeans call the Enlightenment, right?
Yes.
But as we know, those of us who are Black, those ideas germinated at the same time as transatlantic slavery. And in our understanding, those ideas have always been false, always provisional, like always partial. Those ideas have basically been understood by us to be specious, right? If we didn't understand that, we'd be in deep trouble, right? And as you so cogently point out in your forthcoming book, The Long Emancipation, part of Black consciousness has been that understanding. And for many of us, the falling away of the facade of care is not any more alarming than what we lived in each epoch of the evolution and deployment of these ideas, and live more or less every day. We've worked with the boundary of those ideas, and we even signal them in arguments, those ideas, right? Because those are the ones the society says we must touch on. So in our arguments against injustice, but in the main, we are very wise and we distrust them, right? So these are some of the things I've been thinking about as I wrote this poem. I began to write it like about a year ago, actually. Um, and just thinking through, where we were in the world now. And this throwing people in and out of work is not news. This redistribution also of the blame for the spread of the virus. Very, to listen to the language really carefully, you know, uh, about that. So the blame is being shifted ever so slightly from those large institutions to individuals, right? And that's not unusual. Um, I think that the job of the neoliberal government at this stage is to manage people for the purposes, as it always was, to manage people for the purpose of capital accumulation. And their talk is like a really thin, layer, a little thin patina under which lies the true aims. And I don't mean that they're being deceptive at all. They're very clear.
Yeah.
They're actually quite clear. I mean, as clear as the ledgers kept so lovingly and copiously during New World slavery, right?
Yes.
And when we look at those ledgers, we see the apparatus of that system. And when we hear the speeches of politicians today and talk about the share price commodities and the deficit, the quarterly profits, the stock exchanges. And by the way, yesterday or so, I learned that from someone on Twitter that the 44 richest Canadians became $53 billion wealthier during the pandemic. So,
Yes.
So if we look at those ledgers, their talk and those ledgers, we know in this neoliberal age, we may read as we read those earlier ledgers, the map of our ages and the apparatus of the system.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm going on and on.
Well, I was going to ask you two things. One,
okay.
Do you have a Twitter account now? But you don't have to answer that.
No, I'm on no social media. I'm a, what do you call that person who sort of stalks
a
around?
lurker.
I'm a lurker, but I have no presence in that.
Yeah.
I can't
There's
keep
a
up
really there's a really thin slide between a reckoning and an accounting, and I was
Yes.
really glad for the way in which you invoke Sylvia Hamilton's exhibit, and then that made me think about the poetry that comes from that exhibit. And I alone escaped to tell you.
Yeah.
And it seems like whatever epoch we're in, Black people are the ones alone escape to come back and tell. And yeah, and it's kind of like this question then, as you introduce the poem text around the Black aesthetic, I and we, that was really, really striking. And I was thinking about, and this is the question for the OISE people who love the word pedagogy. but I'm thinking about what you just read to us as a kind of pedagogy, a pedagogy of looking, of seeing, of bearing witness, of noticing both the grand sweep of the worlds that we're in and their tiny, tiny skeletal detail. And it's a pedagogy that also though of how we see and how we hear and even how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And this really got me thinking about, as you know, I shadow box the CBC radio almost every day. And a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to the Sunday magazine on CBC radio. And there was a segment that was really interesting. And the presenter introduced the segment on the history of the KKK in Canada. And the segment was introduced and proceeded to unfold as a surprise. And it really struck me because, and again, because you invoke Sylvia Hamilton from Black Nova Scotia and so on. Yeah. But at the end of the segment, the presenter concluded it by playing a song from the a cappella group For the Moment that was written in the 1980s about the KKK out east in Eastern Canada. And it kind of left me wondering, like, how could Black people have not been imagined as a part of the audience listening? that Black people know that the KKK exists. We know it exists in Canada, and so who's being opened up to surprise by this? And it was that was an interesting kind of pedagogy of, at least for me, the experience of the pedagogy of this alienation at the same time that I'm shadow boxing it. And so part of what I hear working in your poem text, and when I think about these different kinds of moments, are you kind of give us a sense of the comportment of and for dealing with the way in which we also get represented through death, through our skeletal selves, through our always barely alive self, right? And yeah, maybe. So yeah, I'm thinking about all the ways in which this poem collects and notices and sees and feels a sense of Black death, whether it's a citation of cadmium in our phones from the Congo and what that means, whether it's COVID, whether it's the repeatable deaths of Black people on YouTube played over and over again. And to think about, maybe we can think about what we practice as a comportment of Black people, which is that we don't strike back. We don't take life in the same way that our lives are being taken every day. And I wonder, what you want to say something about what it means to kind of mark that restraint on the part of Black people at the same time that you craft these lines about our death, because clearly Black people practice a comportment of a certain kind of restraint that is also staggering in relationship to all of the other stuff that comes at us. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so true. I mean, part of the poem that I didn't read was kind of the business of those YouTube deaths, the circulation of YouTube deaths. But to your first point about the recirculation of what I call the recirculation of white innocence. Yes, so that on the CBC every decade or every 5 years or so, it's a surprise that that racism exists. Yeah. And so I call that the kind of recirculation of white innocence in reiterations of wonder at the existence of the very thing that keeps constituting whiteness and reconstituting the making of the Canadian nation state, right? Like it's the very thing. Whiteness is the very thing that constitutes the state, but it's the very thing that's forgotten each time. This is a kind of fiction of innocence or anomaly, or worse, right? It attempts to look away, and very many times within its articulation, it looks away from the U.S., right? So it's always posed, in opposition to something that happens in the U.S. but doesn't happen here. So it attempts to look away at its own constitution in a way, away from the U.S. because we are not like them, supposedly, and who this we is exposes who this we is, of course, right? The implication is, of course, we whites are not like that, because it's certainly, as you say, not us, not Black people in this state. So it attempts to look away from that and look toward. And so it's toward, strangely, is to another kind of whiteness, that is Europeanness, namely the British, right? So that's the toward that it moves to, right? And it assumes that those historical atrocities perpetrated by the British white settlers, are so far away on Indigenous people and Black people, are so far away as not to be noticed, right? So it grabs a certain manifestation of Britishness that has evacuated all of those things. It evacuated its own history. But of course, here is innocence. This innocence finds itself right up against the burglary, and of Indigenous land, right? And the massacres of Indigenous people and and their ongoing immiseration, right? So the dissemination of this innocence fiction is key to knitting the nation together with one story, right? One innocent story, one of morality that keeps the whole system stable, and all the legitimating apparatus are at work on what we might now call nation fiction making constantly, right? I don't know how they don't get kind of tired of remaking that fiction.
Yeah.
I don't
But it's
understand, you know.
really it's really grounded in a kind of white Canadian sense of the South. As you're answering, just reminded me of George Grant's Lament for a Nation, you know, which is considered like one of the important texts of thinking about Canada vis-a-vis the US.
Right.
And one of the points that he is intent on making, that about securing Canada's difference from the US, is that Canada doesn't have the black problem that the US has. Now, of course, if Grant could wake up today, he might be in shock. But also meant that he had to not notice a hell of a lot at the time that he was writing Lament for a Nation too. And so it was that kind of shadow boxing. And of course, the work of somebody like Sylvia Hamilton really puts all of that into a certain kind of crisis. And yet the whiteness lives in this crisis and doesn't seem to understand it. And so even though the presenter in that particular show was not a white person, that was, I experienced that, as the way in which white supremacy, if you will, shapes an institution and shapes an institutional attitude in which whole segments of the audience simply cannot be imagined. And yet we're able to comport ourselves to the degree that we have never burned down a CBC. Right? We have such restraint.
We tried everything. You know, interestingly, it also relates to art being produced too, right? I find nothing so didactic, in a sense, as European art. I mean, that's a huge statement I just made. Some people are comforting, but I know you'll have my back. But what I mean by that is that it reproduces, just like those statements reproduce and recirculate all the time, this Innocence Project, right? That there is some art, and that includes poetry, and it includes painting, etc., that recirculates white supremacy without, you know, countering ever what it is. That the only thing discoverable in it, in a sense, is white supremacy, and it has called itself a name, universal, right? The notion of universal art is so imbricated with white supremacy, and so that's another place that needs kind of undoing. But the other thing I was thinking of was that this only happens within these apparatus that become like archaic in some ways, because on the ground, everyone isn't taken in by it, of course, right?
Exactly.
And if we look at this summer, we saw thousands of young people on the streets in Toronto, in Montreal, in Halifax, wherever, supporting Black Lives Matter in many cities across this country, right? We saw the people making connections with Indigenous struggles, with struggles against anti-Blackness, with struggles around defunding the police. And sometimes these were reported in mainstream media as if they were merely kind of copying a fashion, if you will, from the US, and reported with the same innocent wonder, as if, what the hell are they doing on the street suddenly? Suddenly they were surprised at that. So, but something else is going on that isn't being apprehended or is being countered by the innocence narrative, right? So not everyone is innocent about this. And so they report that with the same innocence and the same wonder as the KKK in Canada. But it hardly matters, to me, it hardly matters how that apparatus sees what we do for our liberation, right?
Yeah.
By that I mean, we are still going to fight for that liberation, and we're still going to call out injustices. And as long as they have a machine making Black death, we'll have a machine making Black life, you know? And these are not just, I think, not just white voices trying to undermine the project of Black liberation. You know, recently, with a world, like a whole world, calling to defund the police and against the militarization of our lives, from Lagos to London, Manchester, New York, LA, Toronto, Halifax, Montreal, Paris, everywhere. Barack Obama says defund the police is only a snappy slogan.
Oh my.
Like all of this is a massive movement, right? Well, what I think of it, like I say, well, happily he's not the head of the movement, like, right?
Yes.
He is not the leader of any Black liberation movement. He had power and nothing happened. That is, our liberation didn't happen. He had power and here we are, right? He had power and George Floyd was murdered, right? Um, so it hardly matters telling us what to say and how to say it. And I think that's fair enough. Organize the way you want, right? Organize as he can organize as he likes, and leave us to organize the way we like. Defund the police is a profound call to reorganize life and community. It is a call to reorient fealty, to reorganize care and safety, rather to attend to care, to attend to, and by attend to I mean to usher in the end of racism, to
And
attend to
capitalism.
and capitalism, to attend to sexism, to attend to homophobia, to attend to transphobia, to attend to xenophobia, to live in a way where the response to all emergencies aren't accompanied by brutality, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore recently reminded us that abolition is both tearing down things and remaking things. That's what we mean, right? And what she says too is that what abolition is more than anything else is presence. So I think instead, not of the apparatus of white myth making, but of all the artists and activists and thinkers operating on the level of materiality to bring that new world into view, right? So insofar as the recuperation of the historical land, the elaboration of our present, let's look at the work, for example. Like, so I like the CBC, whatever, let's look at work like the work of Sylvia Hamilton, her films, for example, Black Mother, Black Daughter, The Little Black Schoolhouse, and others, and the exhibit that I talked about earlier. Or let's look at Camille Turner's artistic practice, her Hush Harbor and her Wanted series and the Afronaut Research Lab. And let's take Wade Compton's, rethinking and bringing to our attention Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. Or let's talk about Charmaine Nelson's work on slavery and history, art and monuments, or Karina Vernon's anthology of Black Prairie writing. Let's look at the massive work that someone like Makeda Silvera did at Sister Vision Press in the 90s and the 2000s, where she was responsible for publishing so many works of Black, Indigenous, and queer writing, right? And then to her own, that work I also hailed, Silenced, that look at the exploitation of Black women's labor in Canada. Then Afua Cooper's like the Hanging of Angelique, a major intervention into Canadian historiography on slavery. And you, Rinaldo, you and your ongoing work from Black Like Who to Queer Returns to Black Life, which you co-wrote with Idil Abdullahi, and the forthcoming book, The Long Emancipation, which I've been waiting for. Like all of this work, I think has effects, right? All of this work has effects, and we do not have control of the mainstream apparatus of dissemination, and perhaps we don't have to. You know what I mean? Perhaps we don't have to, since its only project, right, is to revise and revisit white mythologies. Then too, we are not simply up here in the North. We belong to a network of people thinking liberation. Canada joins Nairobi, Durban, Cleveland, Kingston, Atlanta, Manchester, Salvador Bahia, New York, Chicago, Lagos. I mean, like our intellectual and geographic borders are porous and not patrolled in the ways that nation states would have them patrolled. And then weakly try through these apparatus to embarrass or stymie our efforts to think through and beyond theirs. So I'm thinking of all of that. And, I'm thinking, I'll shut up after this thought.
No, don't shut up.
Wait. I'm also remembering, a conversation I had in 2018 with Leanne
Vincent.
Simpson, Leanne Bedasomese Simpson in Literary Review of Canada. And we were talking about her then work, as we have always done, Indigenous freedom through radical resistance, about art. And we were talking about art and politics. And then in a letter to the review, right, talk about connections. The scholar Kiguro Masharia, and he must, I'll have to excuse myself for Hispanicizing his name. He responded to us from Nairobi saying this, and let me quote the letter, I have it here. He says, "From Nairobi, I have been thinking about Black diaspora frequencies, what it means to be situated as a scholar of the Black diaspora, pursuing freedom and writing toward other scholars of the Black diaspora who are also pursuing freedom, to listen to and write in these lower and minor frequencies. Often these lower and minor frequencies are interrupted, impeded, distorted, and damaged, and therefore the work of diaspora transmission must include not simply listening for, but coding and decoding and repairing and inventing different ephemeral frequencies." Like I just thought, when I read that, I just thought, what a lovely letter from him. So yeah,
Yeah, and there's
and
something
what great
about,
connections,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's something about those frequencies, those impulses, those feelings, those things that we notice that, if you
Yeah.
will, activate connection that is beyond these nation forms. And I was thinking, when
Precisely.
you invoke George Floyd, that one of the things that Idil Abdullahi pointed out to me as people took to the streets in Canada and so on,
Mhm.
was not an attempt to make a comparison, but to say, and this is where this notion of frequencies comes in for me.
Mhm.
But right here in Canada, we also saw a Black man beaten to death
Mhm.
by the hands of a policeman right in Ottawa,
Yes.
Abdi Rahman Abdi. Right. So there's something about seeing the George Floyd and knowing that we were living with that
Mhm.
also propels people into the street, and
Precisely.
propels people into noticing and making connection, so that connection
Yeah.
is not only just the material, but it's about a certain kind of sense of self, a sentient self of self, in
Mhm.
which we experience and see a set of practices enacted on Black people regardless of where they are. you know
Precisely.
the
Yes.
border and the boundary at that point is meaningless to us,
Exactly.
around these
In
kinds of
fact,
questions of violence.
it always is meaningless, because
Yeah,
we know how those borders and boundaries were produced. Yeah. And so,
exactly.
I'm equally reminded of Patrick Chamoiseau in his
Mhm.
book Migrant Brothers, when
Yes.
he talks about the concept of living in relation, right? And he says, like, there's an ecosystem of relation, and that it requires, at the very least, that we guarantee human dignity, and we provide it with the means to survive and continue its quest, and that we accompany it as we should, as much as requires. So we only have to attend to the knowledge that we have derived from the world, not to the repeated um, not to the repeated lie, basically, of capital and coloniality and racism, and how that is produced. But there are knowledges that we have produced in the world, that we understand about the world, and those are the ones that we attend to, and those are the ones that we that that make us notice what is happening, and notice it globally. Yeah, and understand the register that it is playing, because we've always understood that as a world system, that capital as a world system, you know. So just to go back for a minute to the defund the police is one aspect of this larger project, and it's a call, if I might use Chamoiseau and Glissant's notion of, it's a call to live in relation, really. who could deny really that, police apparatus of every neoliberal state has grown like exponentially in the last 30 or 40 years or so, and accounts for the biggest budget item in most cities, right? How is that possible? What is going on? Like, we're not idiots. We have to, there's some relation between that and something else. Even as the budgets for, let's say, public housing or mental health or social services shrink. So we know there's a relation between those two things. And, in Migrant Brothers, Chamoiseau is talking about the catastrophes of the Mediterranean, the movement of people from the continent to Europe. And he says, in regard to European responses to that migration, he says, the other suffering authorizes no projection, organizing its transparency and deciding its dreams and subjecting it to what he calls the humiliating rights of the welcomer, right? And so I want to paraphrase him, taking his words here, insofar as Black and Indigenous populations in the metropoles, these metropoles, to say that the neoliberal state has been organizing our transparency, right? And deciding our dreams and subjecting us to the humiliating rights of the powerful and of white supremacy. And this is what we are confronting here with this call, yeah, to address what we see as the point of its connection with us, is that police apparatus. Is the immediate point of connection with us. Yeah. I can't remember the second. You had a second part of the question.
Don't worry about that.
Okay.
I was thinking that maybe we could shift to something that I think really comes from that and really draws, and the way in which police figures as a totem in some of this. In the longer poem essay, you cite Walter Benjamin's notion of emergency situation, which I misread as state of emergency. But
okay. The same thing.
but yeah,
yes.
but what, yeah. States of emergency signal a particular kind of time, a particular kind of logic of time.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, Black life then seems to exceed that, because Black life seems to be in a state of emergency, but the time of it doesn't seem to be ended, or does not seem to end. And yet Black life is also much more than that, which is to say that, as a part of a species, we're always alive and we all have a life, but Black life seems to be doing something else. And as I listened to the poem, I was thinking about, the way in which you yourself are grappling with this idea of life, which is to say, not what life means, but what exactly a life is, and how we might think about a life both within and beyond capital. And so this really made me think about something that I heard you say a couple of weeks ago, where you said that a poem is a marker of time, but and I'm probably paraphrasing you badly, but it's also about future time. And I think about the way in which Black people live their lives. And again, I come back to this idea of comportment, the forms of comportment that Black people occupy within capital, within white supremacy, where the way in which we shape a life goes well beyond meaning, goes well beyond those strictures, so that life there's a quality to life that exceeds everything that bears down on it, that we're living in an emergency and we're also living something else. And we slip out, we can be consumed by what it is that we live, but we also slip out of that consumption. And I kind of hear that being worked out in the poem essay, and I want to know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think capital steals time, right? By organizing time and by managing time in ways that we hardly see, right? In fact, we take for granted and we assign time outside of capital, or time outside of capital is assigned as lazy, and reckless. And coming from Saidiya Hartman's work, wayward. Yeah. And in fact, we take it for granted too, and we assign time outside of capital as lazy and reckless and loose ends and just hanging out, and and people are incarcerated just for this kind of time, for using up this kind of time. Young Black and Indigenous men and women are disciplined and policed for their use of time. There are parents, yes, there are parents who's out of time, right? And that is out of capitalist time, because we have a particular place in capitalist time, right? In a sense, we only know time in capital or away from capital, and our time away and in has been given names and moral ascriptions. So it took me back to, it takes me back to that book by Justin Roberts, Slavery and the Enlightenment in the Black Atlantic. And there's a chapter in there called Clockwork, Time, Quantification, something like that, and the Enlightenment. And in it, he speaks about the systematization of time into the routines of capital, right? And that in a sense, those plantations were laboratories for organizing and systematizing time and labor. Yeah. So I am thinking with this when I say in the poem, capital steals time, or when I think about time. And I'm also thinking that there is a time that doesn't care about any of that. I'm thinking that, as Black people, we're deeply familiar with time, with capital time, and deeply familiar with the time outside of it, right? The time for fleeing, the time for journeying, the time for leaving, the time for moving, right? The time for getting away from the man, the time from getting away from these people, yeah? I think that I say somewhere in a novel or perhaps a poem, I can't remember now, that we are just a bit of mud whipping around in vast space, right? So I'm also thinking with that. And when I think of time in that way, I don't have to attend to capital time or to capitalist time. In fact, in either of those ways. And when I think of time along the lines, if I think along with Christina Sharp's formulation of the weather, living in the weather, that living in the weather as we do allows and necessitates different strategies for living, different strategies for reclaiming time, yeah, reclaiming being. I may have written about these things in some way or another in some of my works about what that moment of going through the door of no return means, that all things can be made in a way. Like all life can be made. If life can do this to you, then all life can be made, and remade and reimagined in some way. And I also think, well, I have to say that every day is a kind of startling opportunity to live differently, right? Given all of that, given what we know, given all the knowledges produced by, our collective experiences in this time. Every day is this opportunity to live differently. Each day is a day to think differently in this project of living and to make something I have not made and we have not made yet. Am I talking anywhere in your direction?
Yes.
In what you're doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because part of what I was obviously, it's very clear to anyone who was listening that time sits at the center of the poem, and of course, time crops up in all of your work. In particular, then all of a sudden, the novel that I wanted to name just went right out of my head. It'll come back to me. That's
all right,
terrible.
fine.
But I was thinking
okay.
about that there's this thing about how time seems to entrap Black life, but that Black life itself is an entirely other barometer of time. And I think you gave that to us in the text, right? But time then is like, but time gets marked as history. It gets marked as fleeting, and time even gets timed as running out. And because time is such a central part of the poem text that you read to us, I was also thinking about the ways in which questions of ecology are implanted in that poem text. And I was thinking about, and I'm hoping you would talk about, all of these multiple ways in which you're working with time, and even the time of art at this moment. I mean, you open again, let me go back to the phrase, you open with the beautiful needful thing. And the beautiful needful thing from
I steal that from Robert Hayden.
From Hayden.
Yes.
But this kind of, but we need that in this time. We need the beautiful needful thing. It's needed. And at the same time, there's something beautifully terrible about it too.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so we're counting time. We're sitting on time. And at the same time, as Black life, as poor life, as life that has to live on the borders of capital, both pulled into it and disposed by it. They also then seem to also give us another meter and another barometer of time. And I heard that in the work when, in the insistence of the IV narrator. She is operating in an entirely different rubric of time, even as she's sometimes subject to it. So I was just,
Yes. I mean, I think that, I think that historically Black people have had to be ahead of time. Be ahead of time and outside of it also. In this regard, to have to notice and watch with both accuracy and anxiety everything that is happening in the world, to take care you survive that world, right? To take care that you understand it so that it doesn't kill you, right? So in the poem, there's the line, I am turning into the something necessary to live.
Yes.
Right? And it is a line acknowledging the contradictory state of being compelled to live under a system of being that offers you death or palliative, right? Death or palliative. But that you must also understand it thoroughly, because it will offer you death or palliative, right? How to escape both those things, how to be constantly in a place of liberation, which does not exist in time yet, right? So this existence is all about knowing all of that at the same moment.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who you invoke, would call presence, right? And when I heard that line really stood out for me, because it really made me think about whether or not this thing called a Black aesthetic in fiction, in poetry, in film, and so on, is actually kind of offering us that other rubric of time. That's where we can go to live another barometer of time that is not entirely subject to the time of capital, the time of white supremacy, the time of having to explain ourselves, the time of, as Toni Morrison would say, not having to be, where we don't have to be grumbles and apologies to other people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that aesthetic offers that it is that aesthetic that I'm trying to kind of work with and to sit in and to observe the world. And it's sometimes, if I can capture it, if I can hold it for the minute, for a second, then it offers another kind of view. It keeps recalibrating all the time, and I have to catch the recalibrations. What I have to do, it is not a magic place either, because what I also have to do is attend to it, I think, quite honestly. And so I think in a poem that I have in, like you, I'm forgetting the names of the books, but in a poem that I have in some book or other, some book, it says something like, if I am peaceful in this discomfort, is not peace, is getting used to harm.
Yes,
So I have to
I know that.
constantly live in that line. I have to constantly live in that line, knowing that I have not arrived at that moment precisely, but also being honest about the moment that I am in, right? Being honest about the level of self-compromise, self-betrayal, the level of impotence and rage and bargaining. And it is not coming to terms in some peace, particularly. It is not making an agreement of any kind, because every time I think about that liberation, it changes. It of necessity changes, right? So it's
I mean, I was like really
yes,
struck with where you began because it echoed Sylvia Wynter's idea of another perspective, not simply another perspective as an opposition to, but a whole other kind of worldview. And the I-we narrative is both looking in on the trouble that we're in,
mhm,
but can so clearly articulate that trouble because the I-we narrator sits is seeing us from an entirely other worldview, and it's that entire other worldview that I
yeah,
since you invoked that interview conversation with Leanne Simpson, both of you offered us that in that conversation.
mhm,
That for those of us reading, we were encountering another way of making sense of the world that we inhabit together, and that making sense is also a kind of propulsive force to
mhm.
make it live now,
Yes,
even
yes,
even though it might not be authorized by capital, by the dominant institutions and so on. The conversation itself becomes an example of how we can live different and better right now. and
precisely.
and
Yeah,
I heard that in the work tonight,
yeah, yeah.
really profoundly.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be the work. And I'm glad, like I've always been glad to be in this work, because wow, for however short the duration, it frees me from those very boundaries of capitalism. And I'm also glad to be in the work with you, talking to you over the years, and being in the world with the Black thinkers that I am now in the world with, the Black and Indigenous thinkers that I'm now in the world with, um, and and bouncing off of those energies. I think, happy to be there. Yeah. Now.
I think we've come up to 2 minutes before we're supposed to be finished, and I'm sure
Yes.
that Dean Jones probably wants to say something. But Dionne, thank you for engaging me in this conversation.
Thank
I
you.
hope that it made sense to you and that
Totally. And I hope to meet you soon in person.
I know I hope we can get together and have a loud
Even though
party at
we
some
live
point
like 3 blocks
soon.
away and you can't just walk over here. No.
I
Okay.
don't leave the house anymore.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rinaldo. Such a joy.
Thank you, Dionne.
This has just been amazing. I'm reluctant to do anything that stops this conversation because it's been extraordinary. My thanks to both of you
Thank you.
for
Thank
sharing
you.
what really felt like a sort of personal, intimate conversation, and one that we've learned so much from. My thanks to Dr. Brand for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
and for providing us with just an extraordinary experience of ideas. I'm going to be pondering this for weeks, I think, and turning into the something necessary to live this. Time, holding our nation together with one innocent story. As long as they have a machine making Black death, we will have a machine making Black life. Anyways, I'm captivated. I'm going to be pondering as we move forward. And of course, my special thanks to Professor Walcott for his huge contribution to this conversation. My thanks to the wonderful people that have spent so much time and energy organizing this event. I especially want to acknowledge Sim Kapoor and her communications team, to Neil Tinker and his colleagues at the Education Commons for their continuing contributions as we learn and work from home. And finally, my thanks to our audience for joining us. Take care, stay healthy, and have a wonderful evening.